Hey guys, so tell me if you've heard this one before. The Constitution is racist, and we know this because it was written by a bunch of racist slave owners who declared blacks to only be worth 3/5 of a white person. If you were taught US history sometime in the last 30 years in the American public school system, this is the narrative you're probably familiar with. But how accurate is it? Well, I contend that this narrative is a myth. Not only are there no primary sources in support of it, there are actually primary sources that explicitly refute it. And that's what I'm going to show you in this video. Now, I have no idea the algorithm gods are going to keep this video monetized. But luckily today we don't have to worry about that because this video has a sponsor.
World of Warships is the awesome multiplayer strategy game that lets you take control of some of history's most iconic ships of war. It's a thinking man's game, containing a nice balance of action and strategy. There's new content being added all the time, which means there's always something to do and new ships to be unlocked. They currently have over 300 ships from 10 different countries to play as or destroy in combat. And guess what? You can play for free. And if you're a new player, I have a special offer just for you. By clicking the top link in the description, new players get 250 doubloons, 1,000,000 credits, the USS Charleston, and 1 port slot. Just make sure you use the code BATTLESTATION2020. That's BATTLESTATION2020. World of Warships is a great brand that supports me and many other history YouTubers, even when YouTube doesn't. So to support the channel, go check the game out by clicking the top link in the description. When the US gained independence in 1783, its national government was operating under its first constitution, called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles managed to get the US through the war, but it was insufficient to address the needs of post-revolution America. The document was highly restrictive of what the national government could do, including procuring the means of defending the country. Almost every action of that government needed unanimous approval of all 13 states, which was not practical. In May of 1787, 55 men from across the 13 states assembled in Philadelphia, initially with the purpose of amending the Articles, but quickly came to realize that the whole document needed to be replaced. Numerous things at the convention were discussed, but most of it was around how the states would be represented in the national legislature.
Anyways, they eventually drafted a whole new constitution for the United States, which is currently the oldest active constitution still in use. The offending part of the constitution ended up looking like this.
Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to a service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons.
Now, what exactly is this saying?
Firstly, the clause is saying that the number of congressmen each state shall receive in the House of Representatives will be relative to the population of each state. Secondly, it is defining who or how the population will be counted, with free persons and indentured servants being counted in their entirety, American Indians not being counted at all, and only 3/5 of the total population of slaves. The narrative we are addressing today is built on the 3/5 of all other persons part.
Now you'll probably notice that the word slavery isn't mentioned anywhere in that clause. In fact, it's mentioned nowhere in the Constitution. That's a very important point, and we're going to come back to it later. So for now, let's just put a pin in it and keep moving. So does the text actually say that black people are only 3/5 of a white person? Well, according to the plain text of the document, no. It's simply a formula for how to count population in order to apportion taxes and representation.
It also doesn't say that each slave is only 3/5 of a person, but rather that 3/5 of the total slave population of a state shall be counted.
Now I'm sure some of you are already typing that the 3/5 compromise is ultimately a determination of how human they are because it ultimately results in black people not being fully represented. But this brings up the question of why the 3/5 ratio is used. Why weren't they counted as whole persons? The US Constitution is famous for possessing a number of clauses that are based on political compromises during the convention, the most famous of which being the Connecticut Compromise, that created a bicameral legislature with a lower house based on proportional population and an upper house based on state equality. Well, the 3/5 clause is also one of these compromises, which in history texts is usually referred to as the 3/5 compromise. Okay, so then what were they compromising on? If you're still holding on to the racism narrative, then you're probably assuming that it came over some discussion over how human they were in comparison to white people. But that's not the case. Let's take a moment to look at the source we're using here. The main source we have for what was going on at the convention come from James Madison's notes. The notes aren't a diary giving James Madison's thoughts on the day-to-day events of the convention, but rather they are a collection of minutes taken from different committee meetings. James Madison was the secretary of the convention, meaning that it was his job to keep recordings of all the discussions going on. Most of the time, minutes don't include word-for-word transcripts of what was being said. However, what they do record are the general areas of discussion that happened, as well as the official motions made in the meetings. I think I might have some Robert's Rules of Orders or committee meeting PTSD, because reading these minutes gave me flashbacks to when I was involved in student government and community college.
How do you know what's good for me? That's my opinion!
After having read through the minutes, I can tell you for certain that at no point during the Constitutional Convention was the relative humanity of blacks in comparison to whites ever discussed. However, what was discussed was the legal status of persons versus property and how slaves fit into it.
On May 29th, the first reference to who should be counted for apportionment in a national legislature was made by Virginia delegate Edmund Randolph, when he proposed that only free inhabitants should be counted. Alexander Hamilton, representing New York, also proposed that only free inhabitants should be counted. On June 9th, during a debate on how the president should be elected, New Jersey delegate William Patterson moved that the committee should return to the discussion of representation in the legislature, during which both Patterson and Virginia delegate George Mason agreed that only legal persons, rather than property, should be counted for representation. It was on June 11th that the 3/5 clause first appeared as a motion made and seconded by Pennsylvania delegate James Wilson and South Carolina delegate Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. The motion read that the representation should be in proportion to the whole number of white and other free citizens and inhabitants of every age, sex, and condition, including those bound to servitude for a term of years, and 3/5 of all other persons not comprehended in the foregoing description, except Indians not paying taxes in each state. Massachusetts delegate Elbridge Gerry responded to this motion by asking why slaves, who are legally considered property in the South, should be counted for purposes of representation, but Northerners shouldn't be allowed to count livestock. The representation of slaves wasn't brought up again until July 9th, when a report from a subcommittee was delivered to the Committee of the Whole, in which they gave a formula for how many representatives a state should get in the legislature. Roger Sherman wanted to know what principle they were using to come up with their formula. In response to this, Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts said, "Some provision of this sort was necessary in the outset. The number of blacks and whites with some regard to the supposed wealth was the general guide. Fractions could not be observed."
Basically, the committee needed some kind of starting point in order for discussions to begin. And through the whole convention, people were trying to find a way to give the southern states a little more political power, because it was assumed that they were wealthier, and therefore a new national government was going to receive most of its revenue from them. And so they wanted to give them some more political power as a kind of compensation for them basically funding the federal government for the first however many years of the Union.
William Patterson had a problem with counting slaves for the purposes of representation, all the while denying them the same rights as freemen. They are no free agents, have no personal liberty, no faculty of acquiring property, but on the contrary are themselves property, and like other property entirely at the will of the master. Has a man in Virginia a number of votes in proportion to his slaves? And if Negroes are not represented in the states to which they belong, why should they be represented in the general government? If such a meeting of the people was actually to take place, would the slaves vote? They would not. Why then should they be represented? Patterson believed it would encourage the slave trade, considering that slave states could import more slaves and increase their total population, all the while not needing to attend to the political grievances of those slaves. This concern was foreshadowed by George Mason a month earlier on June 6th. The people will be represented. They ought therefore to choose the representatives. The requisites in actual representation are that the rep should sympathize with their constituents, should think as they think, and feel as they feel. On July 11th, South Carolina delegates Pierce Butler and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney insisted that blacks be counted as equal to whites for purposes of representation.
Wait a minute, why are Butler and Pinckney, a pair of slave owners representing a southern slave state, asking that slaves be counted equally as whites? Doesn't this go against the idea that whites, especially slave-owning whites, were so racist that they didn't want black people to be counted as equals? Let's not forget, on top of this, that almost every delegate from a non-slave state has suggested that we only count non-slaves for representation. What gives here? What could possibly be the reasoning? The answer, I think, is rather obvious. The Three-Fifths Compromise has nothing to do with how human slaves were.
Nathaniel Gorham pointed out to Butler and Pinckney that 3/5 was the ratio that taxes were to be proportioned at, and that they had agreed to it. But if they wanted slaves to be counted equally to whites for representation, then it should be the same for taxation. It was urged by the delegates representing the states having slaves that the blacks were still more inferior to freemen. At the present, when the ratio of representation is to be established, we are assured that they are equal to freemen.
Basically, Gorham was calling them out on their bullshit. The only reason they wanted slaves only counted as 3/5 was to avoid taxes. Butler tried to retort that the value of the labor from slaves is just as valuable as those from whites, and therefore they should be counted as equals. However, the person-property dynamic was brought up again by James Wilson.
Are they admitted as citizens? Then why are they not admitted on equality with citizens? Are they admitted as property? Then why is no other property admitted into the computation? Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania said that the 3/5 Compromise was a dilemma between doing an injustice to the South or an injustice to humanity. By counting only 3/5 of slaves for representation, an injustice is being done to the South by not counting their full population. But counting their full population would be an injustice to humanity because under that ratio, there would be no discouragement of the slave trade, which he and many others at the convention believed was the greatest evil ever committed.
This belief in the slave trade being evil was so widespread that a condemnation of it was in one of the original drafts of the Declaration of Independence.
He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be both bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. North Carolina delegate William Richardson Davie made the point of the 3/5 Compromise very clear, by saying that North Carolina wouldn't join the new Union if at least 3/5 of their slaves weren't counted. Towards the end of that discussion, Pinckney again moved to have blacks counted equally as whites, but everybody was kinda tired of his bullshit at this point, and only 3 states voted in favor of that measure.
After July 11th, discussions around the 3/5 clause go dormant for a while, until about a month later on August 8th, when Rufus King expresses his apprehension about supporting the compromise without Congress being able to ban the slave trade immediately or without the ability to tax export generated by slave labor. Roger Sherman agreed with him, but encouraged him not to derail the whole convention on an issue that they had already come to an agreement on. But once again, it was motioned that only free inhabitants should be counted for purposes of representation. In support of this motion, Gouverneur Morris gives one of the best speeches at the whole convention.
It was the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The admission of slaves into the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this: that the inhabitants of Georgia and South Carolina, who goes to the coast of Africa, and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in a government instituted for protection of the rights of mankind than the citizens of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice.
From everything I've shown here, it should be pretty evident that the 3/5 Compromise had nothing to do with how human slaves were. Counting slaves for the purposes of representation did nothing but give power to the slave owners. And that's why it was opposed. The attitudes around slavery at the time were not as positive as we are usually led to believe. Remember earlier when I said that slavery wasn't mentioned by name in the Constitution? Yeah, let's take that pen out and look at it again. There are 3 parts of the Constitution that describe the legal state of slavery, but don't use the word. The narrative we've been addressing supposes that the framers of the Constitution were so racist that they were fine with only counting black people as 3/5 of a person. If that was the case, then why didn't the Constitution just straight out say blacks are not human or blacks are less than whites?
The framers of the Constitution were some of the wealthiest and best educated men of the era, and if we assume that they were supremely racist, we can then assume that the general populace were even more so.
If that were the case, then they wouldn't need to use the phrase all other persons as a kind of dog whistle to signal their secret cohort of racists. They could just call them whatever derogatory term they wanted. But they didn't. Why was that? In a single word, it was shame.
During the July 9th debate, William Peterson pointed out the absence of the word slavery from all their formal documents. In reference to the Articles of Confederation, he said, observing that Congress, in their act relating to the change of the 8th Article of Confederation, had been ashamed to use the term slaves, and substituted it with a description.
The majority of delegates, including the slave-owning ones, saw slavery as horrid and evil.
Not only do I pray for it on the score of human dignity, but I can clearly foresee that nothing but the rooting out of slavery can perpetuate the existence of our Union, by consolidating it in a common bond of principle. The magnitude of this evil among us is so deeply felt and so universally acknowledged, that no merit could be greater than that of devising a satisfactory remedy for it.
Even Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't at the convention, saw slavery as immoral.
For in a warm climate, no man will labor for himself who can make another labor for him. This is so true that of the proprietors of slaves, a very small portion indeed are ever seen to labor. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis? A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever.
Now, did the actions of these men match their words? No. And were these men racist by modern standards? Yeah, they most likely were. They were flawed human beings, born into a situation that they rather wouldn't have been. Does an imperfect application of values automatically make someone a hypocrite? Now, I've spent all this time debunking the popular narrative around the Three-Fifths Compromise. According to the primary sources, it has nothing to do with how human slaves were believed to be, and those that are opposed to it preferred them not to be counted at all. So argument over, right? Libtards defeated? Well, no, not really. The idea that the Three-Fifths Compromise declares blacks to only be worth 3/5 of whites has nothing to do with the compromise itself, or any of the historical context around any of the clauses in the Constitution. Here's the chain of being.
The Constitution doesn't abolish slavery, which means the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. If the Constitution is pro-slavery, then it is racist. And if the Constitution is racist, then the whole thing is bad. If a document is racist, you don't need to regard anything it says with respect. And if the document is part of a government, not only are you free to change it, but you are obligated to change it. And if not change it, then you can feel free to simply ignore it.
Now, I'm not trying to say that everyone who thinks that the US Constitution was a pro-slavery document is some kind of lefty who wants to abolish the Constitution and establish socialism or something. But I'm not saying they're not a part of it. This narrative is politically motivated. If you get people to think that the Constitution is bad or evil, it's a lot easier to convince people to change it or even abolish it, even when the questionable parts have already been addressed. This argument ultimately rests on whether or not the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. And there are good faith arguments in favor of that position. And if the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, then arguing that it's racist is a fair position to have. Now, whether or not the Constitution is a pro-slavery document is not what this video is about, but I do plan on making a video about that later. But for now, let's just say that the popular narrative has one less leg to stand on.
This video is made possible by my patrons over at Patreon and by our sponsor, World of Warships. Remember to check the game out and get all the new player goodies by clicking the top link in the description with the code BattleStation2020. Thanks for watching.